Hey everybody! Today we are going to be making a no-sew quilted ornament just like this one from start to finish. I'm going to show you every single step and I'm going to show you how to make it perfectly. So by perfectly, I mean all of your lines will be perfectly straight just like what you're seeing here on this one, and your side one is going to match up perfectly with side two. See how when I spin this around you can see the lines just blending into each other? That's what we're going to be covering in this video, and I promise you it is not hard. Now, before we get started, a really quick side note, this is actually part 2 of this series. In part 1, I cover all the supplies that you're going to need, including fabric, foam, pins, everything that you're going to need in order to make this ornament. And I've even got a printable supply list for you and a downloadable ebook, which will give you all my favorite places to find all of these supplies. So if you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure you go back and check that out so you can get all your supplies ready. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started making this ornament. All right, so something that I talked about in video 1 was the type of foam ball that you're using. And I'll just briefly recap. It doesn't matter whether you use a smooth foam ball for this ornament or a rough textured ball. And the reason why is because this particular ornament has a lot of layers of fabric built up on each other. And so you won't have to worry about any of the rough texture showing through in the end. That's not going to happen. Now, with that being said, a lot of people do prefer to use the smooth foam balls because of the fact that they usually have an imprint on either side of the ball. And sometimes people like to use these as a starting point for each half of the ornament. Now, not all of these smooth foam balls will have the imprints, and sometimes it'll just have one, or they won't be exactly centered on each side. So don't worry if you are using a rough foam ball or if you don't have these little imprints, because when we begin the second half of this ornament, I'm going to show you exactly how to start that second half so that it lines up perfectly in relation to your first half that you already did. Okay, so don't worry about that. If you do want to use the imprints though, if you do have them, then you can go ahead and begin with your first piece right over top of one of those 2 imprints. And remember, you're going to have an accent color and then you're going to have a main color. Again, we talked about this in video 1, so if you need to go back and watch that one, please make sure you do. But for now, we're going to begin with our accent color, okay? Now, every single piece of fabric that you add to this ornament is going to be folded the same way. Now, you're just going to fold over the top edge with the pattern facing out. You're going to fold it over about 1/3 of the way, just like this, so that your pattern is showing on the fold, okay? And this piece of fabric is going to lay right over top of your imprint, so that the center, right below your fold that you created, is sitting right over top of the center of this side of the ornament, okay? And then we're just going to take a pin and putting it just a hair below the fold that you just made, we're going to pin it right in the center, just like this. Now we're just eyeballing the center here, okay? You don't have to measure and make sure it's absolutely perfect. Just eyeball so that it looks like it's roughly center and so that it's just a hair below your fold. Once you've got this pin down, we're going to fold down the left side straight down right over the pin, and then we're going to fold down the right side. Again, straight down right over your pin, and the right side is going to just overlap the left side that you folded down, okay? That way you can take a pin and stick it right through both pieces to hold them both into place, just like this, okay? And you've created a triangle. And now we're just going to smooth down either side of the triangle and pin them into place. And that is the technique that you'll be doing throughout the entire ornament. So pretty simple, right? So now we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it exactly opposite of our first piece. And what we're going to do is fold over that top edge just like we did before, but now we want the top folded edge to sit just over the tip of the first triangle. Okay, so it's just barely sitting right over that tip. And then when we place the pin in the top center, just like before, this time we're going to make sure that our pin sits right in front of that triangle. Okay, just like, I'm hoping that this shows up in the camera, just like this, all right? That way, because of the fact that we placed the edge just over the tip and the pin is just below that tip, Now when we fold down to create our triangle, these 2 points will actually be touching each other, so there won't be any gap in between of them. Okay, just like this. And we're going to pin it down in the same exact way that we did this one, only we want to make sure that we keep our line that we created in the center of this triangle as lined up as possible with the line down the center of the first triangle, okay? And this is going to be important to keep in mind throughout the entire ornament. The straighter you keep your lines with each other, then the more symmetrical and the better overall the ornament's going to look when it's all done. All right, so I'm going to pin this into place just like before, pinning through both of my pieces here, and then smoothing down each side. See how I'm just kind of using my hand or my thumb to smooth it down and then pinning in place, okay? Just like this. All right, so now we are going to do the exact same thing again, but just to fill in these 2 spaces on either side of the 2 that we've already done, okay? So I'm going to take another piece of my red fabric, my accent fabric, and then folding over the top edge just a little bit, just like we did before. But now we want the top folded edge to sit pretty much in line with the centers of the triangles that we already put on there. Okay, so here's the center line of our triangle. We're going to place it so that this edge just sits right across it. Then when we pin, making sure to pin right up against the triangles that we've already placed. Can you see that? All right, and then that way, when we fold down our sides to create the triangle, we will be filling in the gap, and there won't be any gap in between. So you shouldn't have any styrofoam showing through right here. If you do, let's just show you really quick in case you do. If you have any styrofoam and it looks like this, you just need to pull the whole thing out and make sure that your pin is as close as you can get it to the tips of your first 2 triangles. And then folding down the 2 sides and pinning just like before. Now when you pin down your 2 bottom corners, they're going to overlap the corners of your first 2 triangles a little bit, and that is totally fine. Okay, and then for a final time to fill in this last gap. All right, and again, making sure that your line is in line with the opposite triangle. All right, and that is the first layer. All right, so now we're going to begin layer 2, and we're going to do this with our main fabric. Okay, so I'm switching to this green fabric, and these pieces are going to go on just like we did with these 4 pieces, except for they're going to not start against each other in the center the way that these did. So the points are not going to be touching each other. They're going to be starting about 3/8 of an inch back from the center point, and there's going to be 8 pieces in this layer rather than 4. All right, so I'll show you what I'm talking about. So beginning over one of the first 2 pieces of your first layer, and the way you can tell if you don't remember is that the pieces that were the first 2 will be covered up a little bit, okay, by the second 2. All right, we're gonna fold over just like before, but we're gonna do it so that the top center edge is about 3/8 of an inch from the center point. Now after you make a few of these, you'll be able to just eyeball where that is, but you can also use a tape measure and make sure that you're where you want to be. So that's about 3/8 of an inch from the center point. And then I'm just going to pin it in the top center just like before, and then fold down my left and right sides. Now again, we want to keep the center line of this new triangle in line with the triangles from below so that we can keep everything symmetrical as we go. Pinning it down and then pinning the corners just like before. And then we're going to flip it over and do the exact same thing opposite. Now make sure that when you put this next piece down that you go 3/8 from the center and not 3/8 from this point that you just added. Okay, I see that that's a common mistake that I see happen a lot. You want to keep remembering that you're measuring off of the center point of the ornament. That can get a little bit more difficult to see as you go, but just keep it in mind and you'll be all set. And again, I'm just checking my lines and making sure I'm straight. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with 2 more green pieces here and here. And you are probably beginning to notice the pattern now. We're just simply layering pieces folded the same way over each other. Again, I'm starting 3/8 of an inch so that my point is sitting 3/8 of an inch from the very center point. And my line is following the lines below. And then opposite. All right, so this is half of layer 2, and now we're going to do 4 more green pieces in between of the first 4 green pieces. So I'm basically just sitting it right between 2 of my previous green pieces. The center point again about 3/8 of an inch from the center of the ornament, and then creating my triangle. So see how it creates that little star shape in there? So notice that this time the line that we have created down the center of our new triangle is sitting in line with the lines that are formed between the triangles from the layer below. Okay, you'll always have a line to follow, and I know I keep harping on keeping those straight, but I get asked so much how I get my ornaments to look perfectly symmetrical, and this is exactly how. I really put a strong focus on making sure that I'm keeping my lines all lined up with the layers below. And this is also really going to help when we begin the second side, because you're going to be using these lines to help you find the center of the second side. So now going directly opposite of the triangle that I just made. Okay, and then we'll do 2 more to fill in these last 2 sections. All right, and that is layer 2. All right, so let's start with layer 3 now. With layer 3, we are going back to the red accent fabric, and we're going to begin over one of our first 4 pieces from the layer that we just did. And again, you can always tell which ones are the first 4 because less of them will show because they're covered up by the second 4 pieces in that layer, okay? And the reason why I do this is because I think it just gives it a more symmetrical, nicer look when it's all done. You technically could start anywhere. You could start over one of your last 4 pieces, but overall, I think when you begin the same on every layer, it just looks nicer in the end, okay? So starting over one of your first 4 pieces, this time we're going to begin about 7/8 of an inch from the center point. So last layer we were 3/8 of an inch from our center point. Now we're going to start about 7/8 of an inch from the center point. And let me just grab my trusty tape measure here so I can show you. So if my center point is here, we want to begin about 7/8. So let me move this guy up just a tad. All right, that's close right there. All right. And again, you can get to where you're eyeballing this eventually. When you make a few of these, it becomes very easy to eyeball. And keeping my line in line with all the lines below. I'm just looking at it here. It's kind of hard to see when I'm aiming it towards the camera and not my own eyeballs. And then pinning everything just like before, okay? And I'm gonna flip it over and then do the same thing opposite. And then we're going to repeat this 2 more times over those 2. And there you go. That's the first 4 pieces of layer 3. And now we're going to do 4 more to fill in the remaining gaps. This time, however, they're going to be a little further back than the 7/8. So for these 4, they were about 7/8 inch from the center. But for this next 4, we're going to put them about 1 inch to 1 1/8 inch further back. And that's just to show a little bit more of the green for this particular layer. Okay, so this is going to be right about there. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a little more of the green here showing than there was on these inner layers. All right, so we've got layer 3 done and we've got 1 more layer to go. We're going to go back to our main fabric for this layer. And this layer is going to be a little bit easier than the last layer because for every piece, they're going to be about the same distance from the center. As a matter of fact, we're going to be using the 3rd layer as our starting point because we're starting to get a little bit further away from the middle. So I find it's just easier to go off of our last layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit the points of our new layer about 1/4 of an inch or so from this last layer, okay? Now, when it comes to all these measurements that I'm giving you, these are just guidelines. The most important thing is that whatever you decide you're going to do, however spaced apart you want your layers, is that you're consistent. If you decide you want a little bit more of this layer to show, you can do that, but you just want to make sure you do it the same for all of them so that it looks even and symmetrical. You'll also need to take into account the size of the foam ball that you're using. The measurements that I'm giving you right now work really well for the 4-layer ornament on a 3-inch ball. If you're using a smaller or a larger ball, obviously you're going to need to change up your measurements a little bit. So just take what I'm telling you as guidelines and play around and experiment. There really are endless possibilities when it comes to these ornaments. Okay, so right here I've done about 1/4 of an inch. There's about 1/4 of an inch showing of the red right below. And again, keeping my line lined up with the lines throughout. And those are the first 4 pieces of this layer, and then we're going to do the same thing, of course, to finish covering the last 4 red pieces that are left. All right, so that is the first side all done, and now we're going to flip it over and begin the second side. All right, so remember how in the beginning of this video I mentioned using the imprint in the smooth foam balls to help you find the center of each half of the ornament. And I began the first half of this ornament on one of the imprints, and directly opposite that is the second imprint. However, the reason why I never like to rely on using these imprints, and this ornament is a perfect example, is that it all depends on you getting the first half of your ornament perfect, okay? All measurements perfect. Now, if you used your tape measure and did an eyeball, like I did, then you may have gotten things perfect. But I do find that it's very, very hard to get everything exactly perfect all the time, every single time, all right? So what we want to do instead of relying on the imprint to tell us where the center is, I like to instead use a different method that will help me line my second side up in relation to what I've already done in the first side, okay? So whether or not I got this side perfect, whether my measurements are all exactly dead on or not, I know that when I start the second side, I'm going to be starting it in a place that when I hang my finished ornament, both sides look like they match up, okay? Both sides look symmetrical with each other. All right, so I'm going to tell you how I do that right now. So remember, I also talked to you about how there's inner pieces on each layer and there are outer pieces on each layer. The first 4 pieces of every single layer is what I call the inner pieces, and the second 4 pieces of every layer are what I call the outer pieces. Okay, so these ones that are a little bit covered up here in this last layer, those are the inner pieces, and then these pieces are the outer ones. I'm going to use the lines from these inner pieces to help me draw guidelines on this second half of the ball, okay? And then with those guidelines, I'm gonna have a center point to begin, all right? And it's probably not going to be where that imprint is, all right? So here's how I do this. I take my tape measure and I line it up with one of the inner guidelines from the first half of my ball, okay? Just like this, all right? So here's my line. Hopefully it's showing up in the camera because this is kind of a dark fabric. And I line up my tape measure right with it. And I'm gonna just pin this into place. I'm not gonna press it all the way down, that way it's easy to remove in a second. But I'm gonna pin it so that it's held down, and I'm just gonna bring this around and then line it up with the line that is directly opposite. Okay, so this is gonna be another inner guideline. All right, just like this, and I'm gonna pin it again. Now I'm gonna look at this. I'm turning it towards me a little bit so that I can see, because I can't, when I have it like this, I'm not looking directly at it. All right, I'm just gonna eyeball it and see if it looks like it's pretty straight. And it does look like it's pretty straight to me. All right, and I'm just gonna take my pen and draw a line, okay, right along that edge. And then I can remove my pins, and there's my line, okay? Now I'm gonna do the exact same thing, but perpendicular to the first line. All right, so again with an inner guideline, but the other ones now, all right, we did these two, now we want the other two inner guidelines. I'm gonna pin it along the edge, and then bring this right around, line it up with the opposite inner guideline, and pin it into place. All right, so I can actually see my imprint. I actually was pretty centered, but if you're using a rough foam ball that doesn't have imprints, then you can use this method and it's going to really help you find the center point. Or if your imprints are not centered, or if you did not keep things perfectly aligned up on the other side, then this is going to help you. Okay, and I'm just eyeballing this to make sure it looks straight to me. And then I'm going to hold it so it doesn't wiggle on me when I'm drawing my line. Okay, now where these two lines intersect is where I want to begin my next layer. So you can see that that is just, let me see if I can show you in the camera. You can see how it's just slightly off from being dead center in that imprint there. So that wasn't too bad. All right, now I want to make sure that this side is pretty lined up with this side in terms of the inner layers and the outer layers. So now looking at my first side again, I know that my inner layers are here and here. You can see because those are the smaller pieces, the more covered up pieces, and also they're in line with the lines that I just drew. Okay, all my inner pieces are in line with the lines that I just drew. And so to keep this second half consistent with the first half, we want the inner layers on this side to also line up with the guidelines that we just drew. Okay, so the guidelines not only help you find the center, but they also show you where to line your center lines of your triangle. That was a mouthful, so I'll just show you. That might be easier. So when we lay our first accent piece on this side, we are going to lay the top folded edge along one of our lines that we drew. And then the center, where we're going to place our pin, is going to line up with the perpendicular line. Okay, and by doing this, we are going to ensure that the inner layers of this side match up with the inner layers of our first side. This really makes a difference in the finished ornament. Everything comes together so much nicer when you do this, okay? So now, when we fold down our pieces, we are basically lining up our lines right with the guideline, okay? So it's really nice and easy. Our line being straight, right down the center, lining up, And then I'm going to place my pin so that it holds down both halves, just like we did in the entire first half of the ornaments. All right, so now we're going to flip it over and do the exact same thing opposite. Now again, when we fold our piece over, we want the folded edge to sit just over the tip of our first half, or I'm sorry, our first piece. And we're going to place the pin so that the pin is just touching the tip. It's not piercing the tip, but it's touching it. That way, when we fold down each half to create the triangle, the tips are touching and there's no gap. And I'm going to make sure that my line is lining up with my guideline that I drew. And there we go. Now we're going to do the exact same thing to fill in these two remaining gaps. Again, keeping our line lined up with our guideline. So I made my pin a little too low on my piece, and so I could tell that I was going to have a gap when I folded. So just raising it up a teeny bit, and I've still got a little bit of a gap, but that's kind of good. So I'll show you what to do here. Well, first of all, just adjusting will help, or you can always take your pin out and just raise it up a little. Okay, just like this. So I raised it up just a tad, and now when I fold down my two pieces, I don't have a gap. All right, so there's the first layer. You may notice that the white space that's still showing is not even. See how I've got a little bit extra right here? There's more space showing here than there is here. That's totally fine. And that is the whole reason why we did that whole guideline thing, because none of this is going to be perfect. None of this is going to give you a good indication of where the center is over here, okay? But we found the perfect center, and now when we bring all of our pieces out, we're going to meet and cover all of these raw edges, and we'll be right in the middle of the ornament, okay? All right, so let's start with layer 2. We're going back to our main color fabric, and just like on the first half of the ball, this second layer is going to begin about 3/8 of an inch from our very center point of this half of the ball, okay? So my top folded edge of this new piece is going to sit about 3/8 of an inch from the center point. And I'm going to place my pin top center just below my fold. And now when I create my triangle by folding down the left and right sides, I'm going to make sure that my lines not only line up with my pieces below, but I also want to line them up with my guideline, and in turn that lines them up with the pieces from the first half of the ornament, okay? So you may have to adjust a little bit. That's totally fine. You just want to make sure you line those up before you place that pin. Okay, so see how my lines are lining up now? And we're going to do this for a piece here across opposite of this one, and then for the other two pieces opposite those two, okay? All right, and then we're going to do 4 more in between of these 4 to complete layer 2. All right, there is layer 2. So now we're going to begin layer 3. We're going back to the accent fabric again. And remember, we're going to begin over the first 4 pieces of our last layer. And this time we are starting about 7/8 of an inch from the center point. Okay? And that's just for these first 4 pieces. And then we're going to bring the second 4 pieces of this layer back a little bit more than that. Now again, we want to follow the lines. However, you'll notice that we don't have our guidelines anymore. Those are covered up. That's fine, but we'll just use the lines from the first half of the ornament. Okay, so everything should be lining up pretty good at this point. Now with this layer, you'll begin to notice that some of your fabric, the bottoms of your triangles, may begin overlapping the first half of your ornaments. Okay, just like it's starting to do here. This might not happen on all the pieces. So for example, right here, I'm not really overlapping too much. But it may happen with some of the pieces, especially with the final 4 of this layer and then the next layer. So what you want to do, this is totally fine if the fabric is overlapping, and it probably will in some cases, but you want to keep the pins from overlapping. And sorry, there's a thunderstorm rolling in, so hopefully the thunder is not too loud in this video. You want to keep your pins themselves from going into the first half of your ball. And the reason why is so that you will be able to trim this fabric after you finish the layer. Okay, this is going to be about the center of the ornament. So basically you don't want any pins to go past the center. And this is just a matter of eyeballing, and you don't need to worry too much, because if you accidentally pin too low, all you have to do is take the pin out and it's no big deal. All right. But just something to watch for. You're going to see that a little bit more with the next couple of pieces that I add. All right, so there's the first 4. And now we're going to add 4 final red pieces, and these are going to be about 1 inch to 1 1/8 from the center point. Okay, just like we did, whoops, wrong color, just like we did on the first half. So a little more of the green is going to show here, or whatever color you're using as your main color. And now I am following my lines just like always. And now here's where you'll really start to see that overlap that I was just talking about. I'm keeping my pins up a little bit higher than I normally would, so that when I finish this layer, I will be able to just trim this right off. All right, so that's the end of layer 3. And now before I begin layer 4, I'm going to go ahead and just trim this up a little bit. So what you want to do here when you trim, you want to be careful because you don't want to accidentally, when you go to trim this off here, you don't want to accidentally stick your scissors in to the first half of the ball like I'm showing right here. And I did this all the time when I was first learning to make these. And it's kind of hard to fix when this happens. So you really want to keep an eye out. Make sure you're not cutting into the first half. And then just work your way around. Trimming right below your pin line. All right, so now we are going to start the final layer. And this layer is going to start about 1/4 of an inch from the points of the last layer that we just did. So I'm starting over one of my inner pieces. And pinning right below my fold, just like always. And then this time, not only lining up with my center here, but also with the last layer of the first half. Now again, I want to keep my pins so that they are not coming too far into the first half of my ball. A good rule of thumb is just right near the bottom of the last layer that we just did, because this is pretty much the center of the ball. Okay, just like this. All right, and I find it can be a little bit easier to just trim after the first 4 before doing the final 4 pieces. Now this layer, it's a little easier to know where to place your pins because you just want to keep them in line with the pins from the first 4 pieces that you just did. So that when you finish this layer, you'll have a nice even pin line, which we are going to cover up with a piece of fabric. All right, and then one final trim and we will be all done with our layers. All right, so see how nicely all of our pieces are lining up with each other? Our first half is lining up perfectly with the second half. Looks so good. We're just going to create a band that will cover up all those raw edges. Just fold it in half, almost in half, like this. Okay, and then fold it almost in half again. So basically you've just created a band with 2 finished edges and then 1 raw edge underneath. And we're going to flip this over so that the raw edge is on the bottom. And then depending on where you want the top of your ornament to be, okay, so I usually like to look at it and see what side I think looks the best, the straightest. And I think I'm going to go with this. Okay, so this is going to be the top of my ornament. and I'm gonna lay my band right over top of those raw edges, and I'm gonna pin it once or twice at the top here to hold it into place, and then we're just gonna continue that fold that we started all the way around, covering up all those raw edges. All right, and you want to pull it pretty tightly so that it's not really bulky when you look at it from the side, but you don't want to pull it so tightly that you ruin whatever pattern you have in the fabric. If you yank it really tight and you have like words or a check or something like that, and then you pull it so tight that it looks wonky, you don't want to do that. But you want to pull it somewhat snug, just like this. And then once you reach the top, stick another couple of pins in there to hold it in place, just like this. Okay, you're gonna have a little bit of extra probably, and if so, all you need to do is snip it off, and there you go. So now you've only got one place where there's raw edges, and in the next video we're gonna make a bow and a hanger with ribbon to cover that up, and then we're gonna decorate it a little bit. All right, so I hope that this was helpful. Thanks for watching.